because they were still closing on it. About this time, the co-pilot decided that the UFO was a balloon. It just looked as if the UFO was turning. The pilot agreed halfway, and since the company wasn't paying them to intercept balloons, they got back on their course to Kansas City. They flew on for a few more minutes with the darn thing still off to their left. If it was a balloon, they should be leaving it behind, the pilot recalled thinking to himself. If they made a 45-degree right turn, the balloon shouldn't stay off the left wing. It should drop way behind. So they made a 45-degree right turn, and although the balloon dropped back a little to be a balloon, it seemed to put on speed to try to make a turn outside of the C-54's turn. The pilot continued on around until he'd made a tight 360-degree turn, and the UFO had followed, staying outside. They could not judge its speed, not knowing how far away it was, but to follow even a C-54 around in a 360-degree turn and to stay outside all of the time takes a mighty speedy object. This shot the balloon theory right in the head. After the 360-degree turn, the UFO seemed to be gradually losing altitude because it was getting below the level of the wings. The pilot decided to get a better look. He asked for full power on all 4 engines, climbed several thousand feet, and again turned into the UFO. He put the C-54 in a long glide, headed directly toward it. As they closed in, the UFO seemed to lose altitude a little faster and sank into the top of the overcast. Just as the C-54 flashed across the spot where the UFO had disappeared, the crew saw it rise up out of the overcast off their right wing and begin to climb so fast that in several seconds it was out of sight. Both the pilot and co-pilot wanted to stay around and look for it, but number 2 engine had started to act up soon after they had put on full power for the climb, and they decided that they'd better get into Kansas City. I missed my Dayton flight, but I heard a good UFO story. What had the 2 pilots and their passengers seen? We kicked it around plenty that afternoon. It was no balloon. It wasn't another airplane because when the pilot called Kirksville Radio, he had asked if there were any airplanes in the area. It might possibly have been a reflection of some kind, except that when it sank into the overcast, the pilot said it looked like something sinking into an overcast. It just didn't disappear as a reflection would. Then there was the sudden reappearance off the right wing. These are the types of things you just can't explain. What did the pilots think it was? 3 were sold that the UFOs were interplanetary spacecraft. 1 man was convinced that they were some U.S. secret weapon, and 3 of the men just shook their heads. So did I. We all agreed on one thing. This pilot had seen something, and it was something highly unusual. The meeting broke up about 9:00 p.m. I'd gotten the personal and very candid opinion of 7 airline captains, and the opinions of half a hundred more airline pilots had been quoted. I'd learned that the UFOs are discussed often. I'd learned that many airline pilots take UFO sightings very seriously. I learned that some believe they are interplanetary, some think they're a U.S. weapon, and many just don't know. But very few are laughing off the good sightings. By May 1950, the flying saucer business had hit a new all-time peak. The Air Force didn't take any side, they just shrugged. There was no attempt to investigate and explain the various sightings. Maybe this was because someone was afraid the answer would be unknown. Or maybe it was because a few key officers thought that the eagles or stars on their shoulders made them leaders of all men. If they didn't believe in flying saucers and said so, it would be like calming the stormy Sea of Galilee. "It's all a bunch of damn nonsense," an Air Force colonel who was controlling the UFO investigation said. "There's no such thing as a flying saucer." He went on to say that all people who saw flying saucers were jokers, crackpots, or publicity hounds. Then he gave the airline pilots who'd been reporting UFOs a reprieve. "They were just fatigued," he said. "What they thought were spaceships were windshield reflections." This was the unbiased processing of UFO reports through normal intelligence channels. But the U.S. public evidently had more faith in the crackpot scientists who were spending millions of the public's dollars at the White Sands Proving Grounds, in the publicity-mad military pilots, and the tired old airline pilots, because in a nationwide poll, it was found that only 6% of the country's 150,697,361 people agreed with the colonel and said there aren't such things. 94% had different ideas. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 7 of The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppold. Chapter 7. The Pentagon Rumbles. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean armies swept down across the 38th parallel, and the Korean War was on. The UFO was no longer a news item. But the lady or gentleman who first said, "Out of sight is out of mind," had never reckoned with the UFO. On September 8, 1950, the UFOs were back in the news. On that day, it was revealed by officers that government scientists had recovered and analyzed 3 different models of flying saucers. And they were fantastic, just like the book. They were made of an unknown super-duper metal, and they were manned by little blue uniformed men who ate concentrated food and drank heavy water. The author of the book, Frank Scully, had gotten the story directly from a millionaire oil man, Silas Newton. Newton had in turn heard the story from an employee of his, a mysterious Dr. G, one of the government scientists who had helped analyze the crashed saucers. The story made news, Newton and Dr. G made fame, and Scully made money. A little over 2 years later, Newton and the man who was reportedly the mysterious Dr. G again made the news. The Denver District Attorney's Office had looked into the pair's oil business and found that the pockets they were trying to tap didn't contain oil. According to the December 6, 1952 issue of the Saturday Review, the DA had charged the 2 men with a $50,000 con game. One of their $800,000 electronic devices for their oil explorations turned out to be a $4 piece of war surplus junk. Another book came out in the fall of 1950 when Donald Keyhoe expanded his original UFO story that had first appeared in the January 1950 issue of True magazine. Next to Scully's book, Keyhoe's book was tame, but it convinced more people. Keyhoe had based his conjecture on fact, and his facts were correct, even if the conjecture wasn't. Neither the seesaw advances and retreats of the United Nations troops in Korea, Nor the two flying saucer books seem to have any effect on the number of UFO reports logged into ATIC, however. By official count, 77 came in the first half of 1950 and 75 during the latter half. The actual count could have been more because in 1950, UFO reports were about as popular as sand in spinach, and I would guess that at least a few wound up in the circular file. In early January 1951, I was recalled to active duty and assigned to Air Technical Intelligence Center as an intelligence officer. I had been at ATIC only 8.5 hours when I first heard the words flying saucer officially used. I had never paid a great deal of attention to flying saucer reports, but I had read a few, especially those that had been made by pilots. I'd managed to collect some 2,000 hours of flying time and had seen many odd things in the air, but I'd always been able to figure out what they were in a few seconds. I was convinced that if a pilot or any crew member of an airplane said that he'd seen something that he couldn't identify, he meant it. It wasn't a hallucination. But I wasn't convinced that flying saucers were spaceships. My interest in UFOs picked up in a hurry when I learned that ATIC was the government agency that was responsible for the UFO project. And I was really impressed when I found out that the person who sat 3 desks down and 1 over from mine was in charge of the whole UFO show. So when I came to work on my second morning at ATIC and heard the words flying saucer report being talked about and saw a group of people standing around the chief of the UFO project's desk, I about sprung an eardrum listening to what they had to say. It seemed to be a big deal, except that most of them were laughing. It must be a report of hoax or hallucination, I remember thinking to myself, but I listened as one of the group told the others about the report. The night before, a Mid-Continent Airlines DC-3 was taxiing out to take off from the airport at Sioux City, Iowa, when the airport control tower operators noticed a bright bluish-white light in the west. The tower operators, thinking that it was another airplane, called the pilot of the DC-3 and told him to be careful since there was another airplane approaching the field. As the DC-3 lined up to take off, both the pilots of the airliner and the tower operators saw the light moving in. But since it was still some distance away, the DC-3 was given permission to take off. As it rolled down the runway getting up speed, both the pilot and the co-pilot were busy, so they didn't see the light approaching. But the tower operators did, and as soon as the DC-3 was airborne, they called and told the pilot to be careful. The co-pilot said that he saw the light and was watching it. Just then, the tower got a call from another airplane that was requesting landing instructions, and the operators looked away from the light. In the DC-3, the pilot and co-pilot had also looked away from the light for a few seconds. When they looked back, the bluish-white light had apparently closed in because it was much brighter and it was dead ahead. In a split second, it closed in and flashed by their right wing, so close that both pilots thought that they would collide with it. When it passed the DC-3, the pilot